All right, welcome everybody. It's my pleasure to welcome you to today's event, the COVID-19 vaccines in record time, a conversation with scientists and industry experts from both sides of the Atlantic. My name is Jan Hartmann. I'm the head of medical affairs at Haemonetics, and I'm also a board member of the board of directors of the German-American Business Council here in Boston. This event today is a co-production on the East and West Coast between the GABC here in Boston and the GABA in California and San Francisco. Both of them are independent, membership-based business associations, and we join forces with the General Consulates in San Francisco and Boston to bring you this special program today. It is my pleasure to now introduce you to Consul General to the New England States, Nicole Menzenbach, who is joining from Boston, and Consul General Hans-Ulrich Südbeck, who is Germany's highest ranking representative in the Pacific Northwest. He's joining from San Francisco. Welcome to both of you. You have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Jan. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and welcome to this really outstanding webinar. For the first time, the German consulates and business organizations on the East and West Coast bring together a group of esteemed scientists and experts from Europe, California, and New England. COVID vaccines are on everyone's mind here in Boston. Moderna and CureVac's US headquarters are right at our doorsteps just across the river in Cambridge, and a Harvard professor developed the next vaccine candidate for Johnson & Johnson. And that is exactly why Boston is at the epicenter of today's topics. For the academic capital of the East Coast and the leading hub for life sciences and biotech, it is my great honor to welcome our audience both in Germany and the US.
Ho, 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 if I may. Hello. We do know and appreciate how proud the Bostonians are of their biotech prowess. And we do know that Silicon Valley is best known these days for its tech companies and the increasing criticism these tech companies deserve. But I can't open this panel discussion without stating that the Bay Area is the birthplace of modern biotech, where companies like Genentech and Chiron wrote biotech history and continue doing so. So let's agree that both innovation hubs are the leading biotech cluster in the US. Dear friends, friendly competition aside, I would like to extend a very warm welcome to all the panelists and the listeners of today's event, and give a big shout out and thank you to the organizers on both sides. The three sides basically, because we have people from Europe as well. The topic of the panel, COVID vaccines, couldn't be more relevant and timely. Even if we call BioNTech-Pfizer vaccine the BioNTech vaccine in Germany and the Pfizer vaccine in the US, the joint development in an astonishingly short time would not have been possible without close collaboration between scientists and companies across national boundaries. This achievement is a poster child and a striking argument that we're most efficient and faster if we tackle global challenges together.
I couldn't agree more, Oli. International research cooperation was the key to promising vaccines. Who would have thought that it would take less than 12 months to create not one, but several high potential vaccines? This showcases indeed what we are capable of when we come together to tackle global challenges. Now, we are facing distributions and manufacturing obstacles. As anticipated, vaccine supply is extremely limited. The global community needs to join forces to ensure vaccine access for everyone, especially to the global south. In the next hour, we will hear about vaccine biomechanisms, new strains, global vaccine distributions, and supply chain challenges. And now let me take this opportunity to thank also from my side, our panelists and our moderator for joining us today. And of course, we would not have been able to organize this webinar without our dedicated partner, the German-American Business Council in Boston and the German-American Business Association in San Francisco. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Nicole. And there's nothing to add from me but the announcement for the listeners that this is the first event in a series of discussions between our consulates addressing different aspects of the continuing pandemic. So stay tuned for more to come. And now I don't want to take any more time from our distinguished panelists. I really look forward to the next hour, and I'm sure I'll learn a lot. Jan, over to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you both. It was really nice to see the friendly competition. We'll try to keep that tension in the conversation between the two coasts and Europe that is dialed in as well. So without much further ado, let's introduce our panelists who are joining us today, and they will come on screen momentarily. We'll go first with Professor Melanie Ott, who is the director of the Gladstone Institute for Virology. She's a professor of medicine at UCSF and has been recognized for her contributions to HIV research, the pathogenesis of Hep C and Zika virus infections. And since January 2020, she has pivoted part of her efforts to researching the infectious SARS-CoV-2 and has been harnessing the host response for new therapeutics. Joining from Geneva in Switzerland is Johannes Ahrendts, who is the head of strategy, performance, and transformation at Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance, a public-private partnership that vaccinates half the world's children. Gavi is also co-leading the COVAX facility, founded to guarantee fair and equitable access to COVID-19 vaccines around the world. COVAX will facilitate the rollout of 2 billion COVID-19 vaccine doses over the next year. Joining from Brussels in Belgium is Antony Blanc. He is the Chief Business Officer and Chief Commercial Officer at CureVac, which began development of its mRNA-based COVID-19 vaccine candidate in January 2020, and is currently in a pivotal phase, the 2B3 clinical study. The trial material is proudly provided by the company's substantial production capacities for mRNA vaccines at its headquarters in Tübingen, Germany. Joining me here in Boston is Andrew Bulpin. He's the Executive Vice President, Process Solutions at MilliporeSigma, the life science business of Merck, KGaA in Darmstadt. In his role, he oversees strategy, product management, and marketing, research and development, contract manufacturing, and testing services, as well as the process solution commercial teams. That's quite a bit to do. MilliporeSigma is collaborating with more than 50 vaccine manufacturers to support their efforts in the development and production of COVID-19 vaccines, treatments, and services. A quick note for the guests on the Zoom. You have the ability and chance to submit questions to the panelists, and please do so via the chat feature. We'll get to your questions in the course of the program. Now let's get started. To begin and to kick us off, Melanie, I was hoping that you could talk to us a bit about SARS-CoV-2. What we knew about coronaviruses like this from MERS and SARS, and how it is unique and what challenges it has posed.
Yes, I'm happy to. Hello, everybody. I'm delighted to be here. So we know actually about 7 coronaviruses that are infecting humans. We have SARS, we have MERS, we have SARS-CoV-2, but we also have 4 common cold coronaviruses that are actually circulating quite a bit and that have taught us in the past about what coronaviruses are doing. These are all respiratory viruses that spread through the air via small air droplets. And they're emerging really in animals and eventually adapt to humans and jump species into the human host. Now, spreading is something that is really unique to all viruses. Viruses are inherently dependent on us, on a living cell that they have to latch onto. They cannot replicate by themselves. So they're really, their motto of survival is they have to hijack, they have to multiply, and then they have to spread to the next host. Because if they stay, they either get detected and eliminated by the immune system, or they kill their host and then cannot survive. So this is really, this spreading is what makes SARS-CoV-2 so unique and different from, for example, SARS-1, because we know from actually groundbreaking work in Germany that was published in last March, that this virus spreads when people are not yet feeling sick or not feeling sick at all in the future. So this asymptomatic spreading is really the big problem that we have with SARS-CoV-2, and that prevents it, that prevented us from containing the virus in Wuhan in December of 2019. Because what we could do with SARS-1, taking temperature checks and then isolating people when they had fever and were symptomatic, did not work with this virus because it spreads asymptomatically. It's estimated that in about 40% of people, the virus is not causing any symptoms. So this is a problem, and that really leads us to the point that we need, in order to get ahead of it, we need different weapons and approaches. And one of them is really the vaccine that we're going to talk about, but the other one is really testing, because I think we really, in order to catch asymptomatic spreaders, we need rapid and frequent testing of everybody. And that's something that's very close to my heart, because we have been developing at Gladstone and at UCSF a new method where we're using actually the cell phone to measure SARS-CoV-2. And the hope is that in the future, we will all use this like we use other apps on our cell phones.
That is super helpful, Melanie, for an overview. And maybe as a follow-up question, obviously we're talking about the vaccines today, and we're up to almost a handful of approved vaccines. Can you just talk a bit about the different mechanisms that these vaccines use, and how the technology is, for some of them at least, is very new and exciting?
Yes, absolutely. Happy to. I mean, we really have to step a little bit back and think where we were a year ago and where we are now, and what enormous victory of science it is that we are where we are today with 63 vaccines and clinical trials. In general, these vaccines come in 4 flavors. We know the BioNTech, Pfizer, and the Moderna vaccines. These are so-called nucleic acid-based vaccines, where we give the blueprint of the virus to ourselves, to the host, and then we produce part of the virus in order to train our immunity. The other approach is that we can use a viral vector vaccine. These are the Johnson & Johnson, AstraZeneca, and also the Russian approach, where we basically piggyback part of the message or the blueprint of SARS-CoV-2 onto another harmless virus that then basically induces the immune response. Third approach is the so-called protein subunit approach, where we basically produce part of the virus in the lab and then use these products and inject them, instead of having the host having us do the work. This is the Novavax approach. And then last but not least, the very good old-fashioned way, where you actually use the whole virus, inactivate it and inject it. And that's actually an approach that has been currently pursued by the Chinese. So these are really a whole range of different approaches, and they have been proven in an enormously effective way. But however, we should not forget that we have an Achilles heel there, because the virus can mutate, and it's constantly mutating. And when it hits a barrier like an immune response, variants that can circumvent this immune response can then arise. And that's exactly what we're seeing currently. And the rollout of the vaccine, and also the timing now, about a year after the onset of the pandemic, when we have sort of waning immunity from people that have been naturally infected and sort of ramping up immunity from the first shots of the vaccines, I think is a perfect breeding ground of these variants, and which we all watching with concern. And so the point here is that I think we have to focus on the vaccines, but we also have to, keep our broad approach, including diagnostics, including therapeutics also, to make sure that we are ahead of the curve and can really, get ahead of the variants and make sure that we are successful in our approach. And you mentioned that we are very interested in therapeutics, and I think that's one of the the areas that has been fallen a little bit behind. We don't have really good drugs against the virus currently. And I think new approaches, the approach that we are taking is to go after the host, all the dependency that the virus has against the host, in order to make host-directed therapies that would be helpful against all coronaviruses, and hopefully also future coronaviruses that will come along.
That's fascinating. I appreciate also the comment about the mutations that obviously make people a little nervous to see that, and I think just a good reminder for us to sort of keep the pace up and keep the pressure on the virus up as well, to be effective in this. Antony, I might call on you and just congratulate you, for the entire sort of field, and how quickly you've been able to pull off these vaccines. I mean, you're shortly sort of before approval. Others have already gotten there, but it's been really rapid and in record time. My question to you, one a little sort of maybe challenging, is this what we now can expect, right? At JPM, everybody was like, this is the new normal. Drug development has been accelerated forever, and there might be a truth to it. But then maybe the second question, for that to happen within a year, and for the future, what were the learnings? What really what had to happen to get this really worked out so quickly?
Well, thank you indeed. It's been absolutely incredible. In fact, no one expected it could be possible, because so many paradigms have been changed. And I think this is what happens when you pull out all the stops from the system, and you can really put back to back what normally takes years and years to do. Is it the new normal? Well, first of all, I think what we're seeing is many of the faster technologies now are the ones around mRNA, simply because of the way that it can be pulled together very quickly, coded into, and then manufactured. So you gain quite a bit of time. But while I believe it has sort of redefined the timelines for pandemic preparedness and pandemic response, I don't believe it has redefined yet the timelines for vaccine development per se, because there are things that have been done here that you wouldn't do in a normal course of business. The acceleration, and it seems to me when you read the papers and you're actually doing the work yourself, you're wondering, what is the delta? But the people are worried about, well, have we cut corners on safety? How we cut corners on, and how come it can be so quick? We don't understand, right? So in fact, the answer is simple: no corners are cut in terms of safety. But all the problems have been solved in cash in a way, right? So there is so much resource that you do everything parallel with maximum risk financially and economically, but not taking the risk on the safety side. And so this was, from day one, production processes are being ramped up at the same time. Then you're starting the preclinical and the clinical. You would never do that normally, and it was only made possible because of the support that the governments have decided to put into the industry to make it happen, because there was so much risk that no company would really take it on otherwise. So no, I don't believe it's a new normal, but I do believe it's a new normal for pandemic responsiveness and preparedness. And governments are now more aware about the need for preparedness. I've had many discussions in the past years, trying to talk to governments about preparedness, and it was always, yeah, maybe, stop scaremongering. But it's very clear that it does happen, and as Melanie explained, it spreads very, very fast, and sometimes in unexpected ways, right? So, and in terms of learning, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I think this is fascinating, right? And you pointed out the government support from a financial backing that allowed you to pull these things in and parallelize. I think also about academia and the scientists and what they've provided as starting points, right? Like if you hear sort of about the mRNA technology and where this came from, I think can you talk a bit about sort of the collaborations between government, academia and industry as well?
Yes, of course. There's a lot of that going on. But what you see, though, and the reason it was able to be brought to bear so quickly is none of those technologies Melanie described were invented in one day. In fact, CureVac, for instance, has been developing this for the last 20 years, and it has been kind of a long road in terms of starting in when I did my PhD in 1990s. It was actually an mRNA. No one would even think that this fragile molecule could be, a therapeutic or a vaccine, right? So it has taken a lot. CureVac was founded in 2000. The first GMP lot of RNA was in 2006. In 2015, some bright guys from academia had the idea to put lipids around the mRNA to encapsulate it, allowed to go into the cells and to be expressed. And all of a sudden that became druggable, or something that you could do something with. But there was actually not a lot of belief in the industry that this could really be a new modality. In fact, this COVID has revealed the potential of this technology. And I think that we have only seen the beginning of it, in the sense that now that the variants are coming, for instance, this technology is uniquely suited to following the mutation and essentially dialing into a new form of vaccine, which will protect against the variant. And right. It's quite a bit more easier to do it this way.
Right. No, I think that's helpful. And Andrew, maybe I can call on you. You obviously do a lot of process and supply chain work, and you've helped a lot of these companies to develop the vaccines that are already in market or will come to market shortly. So congrats to you, your teams, and the people you've worked with for making this happen. At the same time, now that we have the vaccines, we're looking sort of at the process of rolling it out, and maybe that's not going as quickly as we thought it would. Maybe it is actually going exactly how we thought it would. We just wanted it ever to go faster, but it couldn't. How are you looking at this rollout? Like, is this like the best we can do? Is there other things we can do to accelerate? I just think about sort of all the folks that met their milestones, made this happen in a year, and they're seeing now sort of like process issues. Like, how can we help?
Sure. And Jan, thank you very much for the question. So at MilliporeSigma, what we do is we help our customers, who are pharmaceutical companies, to develop, make, purify, formulate, and ultimately test their assets and help them to bring them to market through the processes. So if you look through the journey that we've been on, and we still continue to be on, in terms of the development of these vaccines and also the therapeutics, a mixture of modalities. We've seen classical sort of vaccine manufacturing techniques, as well as some new applications, including the mRNA one. And Antony described it very, very well. Just the simplicity and elegance of the mRNA approach has enabled that to sort of spring to the front in terms of speed for the development. From there, we then start to say, okay, well, we need to manufacture material in order to fulfill the clinical trials. And there we get involved in how do we start to template the manufacturing process, and also in a way that can be done quickly, but also something that, if it's successful and moves into commercial phase, can be scalable. And I think one of the, it saddens me to say so, fortuitous is that for these therapies and for the vaccines, is that there hasn't been a shortage of patients or volunteers in order to conduct the clinical trials. And given the number of programs that are running simultaneous, that is often an issue, is to actually get patients on board for this. And as Antony said, then companies were starting to manufacture at risk, i.e. they did not have clinical approval, but they were starting to ramp up their production in terms of getting ready for commercial launch. And that included using their own internal capacity, external through contract manufacturing organizations, and also partnerships, BioNTech, Pfizer, leveraging partnerships in order to have access to manufacturing capacity. What that has done is it has complicated the supply chain and the manufacturing chain. And we see some of the repercussions. Whilst I 100% agree with Antony, there is absolutely no problems in terms of the safety, but just the speed at which these assets are being developed and the diversity of the manufacturing network means that we are seeing things like yield variability from one location to another location. So that's perhaps one of the penalties we've had to pay because of the shortcut. And then now, you know, as we move along in this journey, now that they're approved, it's the whole distribution. For the mRNA vaccines, we know that there is a challenge around sort of the cold chain compared with more classical vaccines. And then even once they get in situ into the location, is how do we actually get them into the arms of individuals and having the infrastructure and setting all of that up. So it's a journey, we're learning as we go along, but you know, kudos to the industry and to everybody because they really have achieved at a speed far more than we could have imagined this time 12 months ago.
Yeah, yeah. And Antony, you speaking about partnerships and sort of, you know, helping accelerate some of these things. You've announced recently, I think, multiple partnerships. One, I'd be curious for this group here, as the, you know, German American sort of a community, is with Bayer in Germany. I think, you know, one of the sort of like the big and well-known German pharmaceutical companies. What is that partnership about, and what are you expecting from it?
With Bayer, it has really been a very important partnership for us, and it will continue being so, because as a biotech company, for instance, we don't have a commercial footprint. We don't have footprint in the different countries. And one of the very important things in terms of safety is when all these vaccines are administered, you need a good pharmacovigilance, understanding what side effects are being reported, and to carry that up, that requires very extensive validated systems, which, you know, only established companies have in place. So they're bringing this, but also are bringing a lot of help in terms of clinical operations, in terms of supply chain, and they really provided help in a number of dimensions where, you know, as a smaller company, it was hurting because of all the multiple challenges you need to tackle at once. And you know, CureVac was catapulted from as a clinical stage company to commercial stage company, making hundreds of millions of doses within months. And so we're really grateful for that fantastic support and partnership we're having from Bayer. And
yeah, I think that's fantastic to hear, and I think you know, I think this has all begun sort of as a story across the Atlantic, and the cooperation and the collaboration between companies. So it's really nice to see that, and to see sort of like, you know, many of these established pharma companies jumping in and putting the patient first, right? Putting the right thing first to help out here and you know, provide the facilities and the capacities. That's really great. Andrew, like one question for you around interaction with the U.S. government and work here. I know that you've been, I want to say, privileged to work with the Trump administration under sort of the Defense Production Act already. You know, the new administration is now in place and have made clear that they will want to use that tool more often. What has your experience been, and for other companies, what should they be prepared for? Like, what is it like to work under those situations?
No, absolutely. Just like to stress, you know, obviously we've been partnering with multiple international governments, internationally and here in the United States, and also with some of the organizations who are coordinating programs. And I'm thinking the WHO, I'm thinking CEPI, I'm thinking Gavi, the Johannes and the whole COVAX program. So very involved and intimate with all of those. So if you think about in the US, as the US government started to help and give financial funding to these companies, normally that's got distributed through an organization called BARDA, and BARDA in turn was supported in terms of sort of program management and program monitoring by an organization, the OWS, Operation Warp Speed, which was basically staffed by US military people. So we've had a lot of meetings recently with different colonels and majors and captains in the meetings. So it's been a definite change for us. But in the US, if you have a production facility that's on US soil, under the Defense Production Act, the US government can effectively commandeer your manufacturing capacity. They can ask you to prioritize certain orders in order that you contribute to the defense effort or to the health effort. And so these orders are what they call government rated orders. and you have to prioritize, and legally you're bound to. What does that mean? Well, one thing we've seen is that I would say the last 2 weeks of December and into the new year, as more and more of these assets are starting to get approved, we've seen a distinct uptick in government-rated orders. And obviously that puts some strains on the supply chain, puts some strains on manufacturing, and how do you rejuggle that and reprioritize it? Because much of the equipment that we supply is custom depending upon the manufacturing template in question. I think the other element, and we mentioned it earlier, is that whilst the asset may belong to an American organization, is their supply chain may be international. And so right now, one of the areas that we are looking at with respect to the US federal government is how do you translate these government rated orders maybe for a supply chain that is based internationally as well. So, you know, each day we're basically tackling the next obstacle, and we're looking forward and, you know, looking at ways that we can help to the effort and to the pandemic effort. But it has been a journey of discovery for everybody. But I think, you know, as an industry, we can be very proud on, you know, what we've achieved and putting our best foot forward to try and get enough vaccines and then get them into the arms of patients and people so that we can get clear of this pandemic sooner rather than later. Right.
Andrew, you mentioned the global footprint, and I think likewise, obviously the virus impacts the world globally. You know, we're privileged, obviously, in high-income countries to have all these resources available, and you know, a lot of the effort I would say is focused on high-income countries at this point. So I think it's important to have somebody who thinks about the middle and low-income countries and puts their interests sort of on the map. And I think Johannes and the Gavi, you know, the Vaccine Alliance, does just that. And I think you announced a great, you know, program yesterday with the COVAX initiative. So talk a little bit about, you know, your efforts to make sure that the distribution of the vaccine is equitable and why that matters.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Jan. And you're absolutely right. So, you know, the low and middle income countries are facing huge challenges, just like the high income countries with the pandemic. So not much difference there, you know, also, you know, somehow stuck in these lockdowns and then really struggling to recover. The additional challenge that these countries face is that most of them simply don't have the fiscal space to pay for these vaccines because, of course, they cost money for, you know, for these countries as well. So it puts them in a quite existential situation, we can probably say. At the same time, it's also interesting to see that there are wealthier countries who are actually also facing issues with accessing the COVID-19 vaccines, and that has multiple reasons. One being some may have made, in a way, the wrong bets, if I can say, maybe, you know, made bilateral deals with, you know, vaccine candidates that ultimately might not make it to market, or where, you know, the schemes have already been abandoned. We have heard news of that recently from some manufacturers like Merck, for example, that ended the R&D. And some are simply too small to be, in a way, a really kind of attractive business partner, you know, for some manufacturers. So basically, to address that kind of fairly complex setting, and I think you mentioned that in your introduction, actually the G20 has come together and founded a scheme called COVAX last summer. And that's led by my organization, Gavi, by the World Health Organization, and an organization called CEPI that invests into R&D for vaccines. And it's really the only global effort to make sure that people in all corners of the world will get equitable access to the vaccines once they are available, regardless of, you know, wealth or ability to pay. And by the way, that scheme has received also, you know, personal support from Chancellor Merkel. So also thank you to our two consuls, Menzenbach and Südbeck, on behalf of Gavi and COVAX for that. So she is really backing this up personally. So maybe the way the scheme works concretely, it's basically doing two things. One is it has invested into, you know, R&D for the COVID vaccine. So we've been working very closely with CureVac, for example, and other manufacturers to support them and in a way help and de-risk their investments. And I think Antony and Andrew were alluding to that and explaining that helps to speed up then the vaccine development. The second and very important element is that COVAX is bundling the procurement of more than 190 countries. So almost all countries in the world have signed up into the scheme. So you can imagine it's a huge buying power behind it. And that helps to, obviously get better prices for vaccines. And it's also an instrument to further de-risk manufacturers because we, contract before the vaccine is actually licensed. So, that makes it more attractive also for manufacturers to produce at risk, for example. At the same time, COVAX has the backing of donors to actually make sure that for the 92 poorest countries, international donors, pay for these vaccines. So the overall objective is to have 2 billion doses rolled out by the end of the year, and that's currently on track. That would help to immunize 20% of the population in these 92 countries, and also support the, the higher income countries in the case, that, maybe they weren't as successful in their deals. So it's going to be a rough ride. It's a crowded space. Things are happening very quickly. There is a bit of, you could probably say competition also with countries who are doing their bilateral deals. But it's a huge commitment and huge achievement of the international community.
Johannes, one follow-up on this. We've seen sort of in the early days what I would, maybe sort of call vaccine, well, it's a rough word, but call it vaccine nationalism. Everyone seemed to be sort of, closest to themselves, kind of like, understandable. Have you seen any geopolitical sort of like implications of who has access to vaccines, who can provide access to vaccine? It seems like we're in a, the vaccine is the new oil. Like, what are you seeing there?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, you're absolutely right, Jan. We do see a bit of like the first come, first serve mentality, and that's perfectly understandable. Right, this is, the pandemic of the century. It affects all our lives heavily. So governments are under huge public pressure to basically strike their bilateral deals and make sure that their, constituents receive access to the vaccines. And I think that's normal and understandable. The risk with that is that, that leads to could lead to a fairly inefficient distribution of the vaccines across the globe. So we might see a situation that, some countries who are maybe a bit better off are almost like a little bit oversubscribed on the vaccine. Some countries have even, as we know, ordered multipliers of their actual populations, in terms of numbers of vaccines. Whereas then others, like we discussed, remain without vaccines for a long time. And you could argue that that's a bit vaccine nationalism, although that's a pretty harsh word. Now, the risk with that is that actually backfires ultimately. And for three reasons. One is, and I think Melanie talked about that, we are seeing these new variants of the virus. And where do these variants grow? It's in these populations that are not vaccinated. These huge kind of pools of unvaccinated people. And we're seeing that through, in these variants we have seen coming from Brazil, from South Africa, from the UK, that rapidly spread across borders. And there is very little that you can do about it. So if we continue to see this, these pools of unvaccinated populations where that spreads, that might lead to increase, resistancy of that virus to the vaccines which are already out there. And then ultimately that brings all nations into trouble. And that could be, that could be a challenge. Second is the economic impact. As we all know, emerging markets that have now issues with access to the vaccines are, growing in importance as kind of trade partners for the US and Germany. If they remain in this lockdown situation, they are kind of, that impacts obviously international trade. Interestingly, there was a study recently from the International Chamber of Commerce, which is saying that the estimated cost for rich countries, due to lost economic activity in poorer countries is about $4.5 trillion. And you can imagine that, a significant share of that, can be broken down onto the US and Germany, actually. So that's quite significant. And the third impact might actually be migration. If countries in Africa, for example, kind of, in a way, see their economies shrink, which they do, that puts, more pressure on international migration. And that, again, might affect Europe and also the US, depending on what happens in Central and South America. So the good news here is that it's being addressed through COVAX, but there are indeed a number of risks there.
That's very fascinating, Johannes. Thank you so much for that perspective, and really puts light on that from various aspects, right? Ethical, moral aspects, economic aspects, and disease epidemiology as well. So I really find this fascinating. I want to acknowledge some of the questions that came in from the audience. The first question I want to direct to Melanie. We're kind of all, I don't want to say patients, but we're all sort of like healthcare recipients here in this panel and thinking about the vaccines. There were questions about sort of how to think about the different vaccines, how to think about the personal decisions, when to get the vaccine, if to get the vaccine. Can you just, a little bit biased here, but can you encourage people that the vaccine is the right thing and help them think about sort of which vaccine they should look for, if they should not wait for any specific one? Any opinions?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, we are in a very lucky position to have choices currently, which is not what we have imagined a few months back. And we have also the luxury of having actually super success rates of these, in terms of 95% effectiveness, even 80% effectiveness. We were when we started this, we were hoping for 50% effectiveness. So we should keep this in mind. All the vaccines that are currently being tested are actually exceeding our expectations. I think the RNA vaccines were the big unknown because we had very little experience with them, and they have basically exceeded expectations so far. But we also have to see how long this is lasting. I think we have fantastic effects now. We will have to continue to study this very carefully, and we will learn a lot about this for this pandemic, for the next one, and for other infectious diseases, as it has been noted in the chat. All what we're doing now is really propelling everything that we do with tuberculosis, malaria, everything else to a new level. So I can only encourage, and also what Johannes just said about the variants, we are really in a tight race currently. We cannot wait. We have, unfortunately, here in the US and worldwide, absolutely out of control numbers of the virus. And that is the problem. The problem is the more people are infected, the more the virus can mutate and can generate variants. So we have to get control of these infection numbers. And the point is that we have a very good chance to get them under control with all of these vaccines that are currently on the market. And there are, advantages, disadvantages, or minor tweaks to each of them. But I can only encourage everybody when they can get an appointment to go and take it and get vaccinated now, because I think the benefits will be personally felt very, very strongly, because you will be protected. And it will be felt as a community because we will get our numbers down, and we will also protect those in the community that cannot get vaccinated, and that's the immunocompromised or other people who have contraindications. So we really have to thrive for herd immunity in order to get that virus under control.
If I can, one point, Melanie. We are incredibly lucky, as you said, to have so many vaccines, which are today, over 90%. Not all vaccines are, even in other areas, I mean, proven vaccines. And the vaccination is first and foremost a population thing, right? So there is a very individualistic, question that comes to me or to others. Well, which one of these should I take? Is it 95 or 91 or, and in fact, I tell people, well, it actually doesn't truly matter, from a population point of view. Because what you want to do is even a 60% or 50% vaccine has a role to play to tone down and stop a pandemic. I mean, 90% we work better, but it's important that everybody is vaccinated, and even with a vaccine which is less effective, it still has a massive impact on a population.
Maybe I can add one more thing. I would say that all the, we see all these numbers, 80%, 50%, 95%. What is the most striking number for me that I have heard in the last few weeks is the 100% prevention of severe disease, even with the variants. And I think that is what we should keep in mind. So even if we take the vaccine and it might not fully prevent us from getting the virus, it will severely blunt the infection. It will shorten the time the virus can evolve, and it will make people less sick. And I think this is for me the most, I was very concerned and very depressed about the variants because the virus is doing what viruses are doing. But when I heard this news, I think it is the best news that we have. And I think the vaccines are going to hold against these variants, and if we are applying them rapidly. And I can only encourage everybody who is hesitating. I'm vaccinated, and everybody in my immediate environment and in the hospital and in the laboratory, we work with the infectious virus. I think we really encourage everybody to get vaccinated, and it's not a big thing.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. And I think, some of us are not vaccinated yet, not because we don't want to, but just simply because we haven't gotten an appointment yet. So one of the questions that came in here is that some of the shortcomings in the supply chain seem to be traceable to sort of, single supply situations or scarcity of, single process steps. Andrew, what's your take on that? How many of those weak points in the chain do we still observe? Like, what are ways around those? How can we set ourselves up for success?
No, I think it's a good question. And let's use the mRNA vaccines as a case in point. Prior to this pandemic, whilst there were a lot of projects ongoing in development, the number actually approved therapeutics made from mRNA was very, very small. And as such, the support, sorry, Antony? Yeah. So, as such, the supply chain wasn't sort of set up for large scale manufacture across multiple assets. And so, to a certain degree, victims of their own success. I know that, we've been working very, very closely to increase capacity in terms of making physical investments in physical capacity, in terms of just people training. We don't actually make mRNA itself, but what we do is we're a major supplier of the synthetic lipids and cholesterols, but the capacity and the need historically compared with where we've seen it migrate today means that we absolutely will have to ramp it up. And that's some of the challenges, is that we're, to a certain degree, victims of our own success, but making huge progress, making the investments, and hopefully a little bit later in the year, we will be out of the woods.
Indeed, and some of those elements have been multiplied by 100, 1,000, 10,000 in terms of how much is needed, and no supply chain can take that, like this. And so we're seeing a lot of that. Yeah.
Johannes, a follow-up question here regarding the COVAX initiative. So, like, how do the recipients, the countries that receive vaccine through the initiative, how do they think about prioritization in their countries? Is it similarly, like, do they go by healthcare workers first, or like what influence does Gavi have on how it's distributed in the countries themselves?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So, these countries are kind of autonomous countries, and they take their own decisions. And, as COVAX, we respect that. At the same time, we have the World Health Organization on board in our scheme. So there are, of course, recommendations on, how ideally one would prioritize these populations. And what's clearly emerging is that there are kind of two primary target groups, and that's very similar to the way, for example, the US and Germany think about this, which are first of all healthcare workers, so people that are directly exposed to the virus. That's one. And we think that's about 3% roughly of the population in these countries. And secondly, at-risk populations. So, the elderly, people with pre-existing conditions, cardiovascular disease, and so forth. So you could probably say that target groups across all countries are relatively similar.
Yeah, okay, that makes sense. Maybe one question for both you and Melanie about sort of, people seem to be thinking ahead already, which is great. But the question is sort of like, what is the next pathogen that we want to tackle with the learnings from this pandemic? Like, where can we have the biggest impact to bring the learnings from this one to eradicate the next disease? Is there like anything top of mind for you?
Well, there was a question specifically about HIV. I think we have been tackling with struggling with HIV and hepatitis C viruses vaccines for a long time because these viruses are super variable. I think coronaviruses are medium variable. They are still, they still do their thing and they try to adapt, but they do this at a lower pace than, for example, HIV and hepatitis C. So you have swarms of different viruses in circulating. And so that makes the vaccine very, very, very challenging. So I think that the new RNA vaccine technology is certainly something that will propel, future vaccine efforts in that area forward, in my mind and my research area, because of the strong immunity that they induce, and also the adaptability and the chance of doing relatively easy multivalent vaccines. And I think that is, in my mind, a very exciting new research area that I'm sure will have consequences for many others in the future.
Right.
And maybe building on this, I think one key takeaway from all of this is that, first of all, it's almost certain that COVID-19 wasn't the last global pandemic. We will see this more and more, and actually a lot of kind of smart people had predicted for a number of years that something like this would happen. And it will happen again. And the reality is that the world is so globalized that these viruses just spread faster than they did, 10, 20, 30 years ago. So I think we can learn a lot actually from this model of, stronger public-private, partnerships and collaboration. Maybe also taking more risks actually to speed up vaccine R&D without compromising safety, as Antony and Andrew were saying. So I think that could actually be a bit of a blueprint how to react to future pandemics. I think what we're also seeing is that generally the world still has a kind of, I would say, a lot of upward potential still in terms of pandemic preparedness and response. And we are seeing that we still struggle to detect the new variants of the virus, for example, and to really trace how are they spreading, and it makes it more difficult, as an example. Or the rollout and delivery of the vaccine has been quite bumpy, so how can we improve that? So I think a lot to learn from this, and might be a good model for the future.
Thank you. And I will open it up on this sort of, I think, positive note, right? I think about the things that we can learn, that we can put forward, because I think we're in a time where we all need positive news, or at least a positive outlook. So what I would ask each of the panelists to do is to think about the one thing that really sort of struck them and how we came together, and how that's sort of informing, and hopeful outlook to 2021 and beyond. And maybe whoever's like first, has the first idea, please go forward, and then we go through the panel. But
I can maybe just start, and I just
Melanie, thank you.
Sort of go back to the theme of collaboration. I think in interaction and partnership. I think in the academic world, and I think in the you know, in the biotech world and everywhere. I think this pandemic has showed that everybody was coming together. Everybody really was sitting back and thinking, what can I contribute? And instead of sort of trying to do it yourself in-house, reaching out to others and saying, okay, you have the technology, let's work together. Instead of pondering 2 weeks whether I should pick up my phone, I pick up my phone in 10 seconds and call the person and say, we need this now. We cannot wait another month until we have produced this ourselves. So I think the enormous willingness to collaborate, I think the new way how we sharing data, everything is now, you know, open access. We share our data ahead of complicated peer review with journals. I think the exchange of reagents and I think the partnerships and the reach to our commercial partners from the academic side, I think is a huge step for me that I think should go into the next pandemic and hopefully will last, would outlast this pandemic that we're currently in.
Thank you, Melanie. Andrew, what are your thoughts?
Well, I was going to build on what Melanie just said. In terms of collaboration and transparency, you know, obviously we work with the who's who in the biotech industry, and you know, company A may have a standing order for 300 filters a month, and given the tightness of the supply chain right now because of this you know, surge demand, is companies have all chipped in. You know, they said, well, we don't really need the 300 this month. You know, we can have, you know, 150 on the 15th, and you can push the next one out by another month. So it's enabled us to manage the supply chain and at least optimize it as best we can, so that we're not shutting down facilities, so that we're keeping momentum, keeping the ball rolling, you know, across the broader industry. So huge collaboration, and it's been sort of really heartening, and let's just hope that we don't revert back to old traditional methods once the pandemic's over, because it's a lot easier to collaborate in an open and transparent fashion.
Thank you. Antony?
For me, it's a sense of optimism in the sense that we have made the impossible possible. You know, when you see 3-4 vaccines now which have these kinds of results, I think we now know it can be done, and we now know that if we're ready for it, we could do it even faster. I'm pretty sure that, you know, at least 95% of all the supply chain problems we're seeing now could be avoided if you plan for it ahead in advance. And now I tell you, given the cost it has, we will plan in advance. You know, there will be installed capacity to produce. There will be reserve stocks of some of the key raw materials, because it's, I think people have actually realized what it means when a pandemic hits.
Thank you. Johannes, your thoughts?
Yeah, I think a lot has been said, and I can only kind of support that and build on that. To me, it's really impressive to see the ability of kind of the community reaching from, you know, academia, research, you know, to industry, to governments, to kind of international organizations, to kind of stand together and cooperate when it's really about solving kind of like a real public interest, you know, that kind of, you know, right, affects us all. And that's really impressive.
Great. Good. Well, thank you so much for your perspectives. Thank you very much to all the panelists for the conversation today. I thought it was really interesting. I think the questions we got showed the interest from the audience as well. So thank you very much for all the participants. Thank you so much for everyone joining us today and listening in. I hope you took a ton away for yourselves. We hope you join us for one of the upcoming events. As the Consul General mentioned earlier, this is only the first in a series of events. And if you're not familiar with the GABC or the GABA, please look us up, reach out to us. You'll find us online. You find the contact information right here on that slide. And as an organization, also personally, we're obviously reachable on LinkedIn, Twitter, and all the usual social media. So connect with us, reach out to us. What remains is for me to leave you all with well wishes. I wish everyone a good rest of the day. For some of us, that rest of the day is a bit longer than for others, but that's part of like joining here together from Europe, West Coast and East Coast. So thank you so much. We hope you enjoyed it, and we look forward to seeing you soon again. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.